The auction hall smelled like old money and fresh betrayal. Chandeliers hung from a vaulted ceiling like frozen stars, casting cold light across 500 of Seoul's most powerful people, men in tailored suits, women draped in understated wealth, faces arranged into careful expressions of polite indifference. But underneath that polished surface, something electric was moving through the room, a current, a whisper. A name passed from mouth to ear like a slow-burning fuse. Seo Tae-gun. People turned to look, some subtly, cutting their eyes sideways while pretending to study auction catalogs, some openly, with the barely concealed hunger of wolves who had waited years for exactly this moment. He stood near the center of the hall, still, solitary, dressed in charcoal gray, no tie, collar open at the throat. Not from negligence, but from something far more dangerous than formality could contain. His face revealed nothing. Seo Tae-gun had a face built for silence. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. A stillness to his features that had always unsettled people more than anger ever could. Because of anger, people understood. Anger was predictable, but this absolute, weaponized calm. This made men nervous in ways they couldn't explain to their wives at night, or it used to. Tonight was different. Tonight, even that terrifying stillness wasn't protecting him from what the room already knew. His empire was gone. Not weakened, not damaged. Gone. 3 of his primary holding companies had been seized in coordinated legal actions spanning Seoul, Singapore, and Zurich. His accounts were frozen. His allies, men who had eaten at his table and sworn loyalty with hands pressed flat against their chests, had evaporated within 48 hours of the first announcement. The speed of it was almost elegant. Someone had planned this for a very long time, and now Seo Tae-gun stood inside an auction hall where pieces of his former empire were being quietly reassigned to new owners. And every person in the room was watching to see if the king would finally bleed. Park Hyun-soo moved first. He was a property magnate, 60-something, with a face like cured leather and the confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades waiting for this exact reversal of fortune. He crossed the marble floor deliberately, flanked by 2 associates, and stopped close enough that Tae-gun could hear him without effort. "I heard the Ganseong Tower acquisition fell through," Park said pleasantly, lifting a glass of champagne. "All that work. What a shame." His associates smiled. Tae-gun did not respond, did not look at Park, did not move. Park continued, warming to his audience, aware that nearby guests had shifted closer to listen. "I tried to warn people years ago. Built on sand. Everything that man touched, built on sand." He raised his glass slightly, a toast to nothing in particular. And now the tide has come in. Laughter, not loud, the refined, contained laughter of people who understood that excess enjoyment was bad manners, but that the complete absence of enjoyment was a waste of an opportunity. Others join. A former business partner, a man whose entire regional portfolio existed because Tae-gun had once extended him credit that no legitimate bank would have touched. Turn his back with deliberate slowness, a government-adjacent financier who had attended Tae-gun's private events for 7 consecutive years made a point of being photographed speaking warmly to Tae-gun's primary creditor. The message was universal and unmistakable. "You are finished. We are not associated with you. We were never truly associated with you." And through all of it, through every turn back, every quiet laugh, every pointed conversation conducted just within earshot, Seo Tae-gun stood motionless, breathing, watching. Somewhere behind those dark eyes, something vast and patient was moving, but nobody saw it, because nobody was watching him closely enough. Nobody except her. She stood 40 feet away, near the far window. You could have missed her entirely. That was, in fact, the point. Adaebi Nwafer was dressed simply, a deep wine-colored dress that suggested quality without demanding attention, natural hair pinned with quiet precision, minimal jewelry, no statement piece. She held a glass of water, not champagne. She had been standing in the same position for 23 minutes, and in that time, precisely 6 people had registered her presence. 3 of them had dismissed her immediately. 2 had offered brief, polite nods before moving on. 1, a woman who handled private wealth management for several of the room's attendees, had paused, looked at Adeobi with something uncertain in her expression, and then continued walking. She was Taegun's wife. Everyone knew that in the abstract the way people know. About furniture, present, contextually appropriate, not requiring further consideration, she had come to Seoul as part of a strategic alliance 2 years into his empire's peak. A Nigerian woman from a family that moved in certain circles. The marriage had been announced quietly, celebrated minimally, and subsequently treated by Taegun's world as a background detail. She attended events, she was gracious, she was appropriate, she did not interfere, and so, in the way that powerful men often make catastrophic errors, the world around Seo Taegun had simply stopped seeing her, but right now, watching from her position near the window, Adeobi saw everything. She watched Park Hyun-soo finish his performance and move away, satisfied. She watched the turned backs and the calculated laughter. She watched her husband stand absolutely still in the center of all of it, revealing nothing, absorbing everything. And then, without looking at her phone, without any visible movement or signal, something in the room began to shift. It happened quietly. The way tides turn, not with drama, but with the slow, irresistible certainty of something that cannot be stopped. First, across the room, a man named John Byung-chul, a venture capital director who had been in confident conversation with 2 of Taegun's most aggressive creditors, suddenly excused himself. He stepped away, pressed his phone to his ear, listened for 30 seconds, and the color left his face. Then, 3 minutes later, a notification appeared on the screens of 4 separate financial analysts present in the hall. A major acquisition, one that had been positioned as the centerpiece of Taegun's enemies' consolidation strategy, had just encountered an unexpected legal obstruction in Singapore. A filing, obscure, buried, but perfectly placed. Whispers replaced laughter. 7 minutes after that, a story broke through a reputable financial news channel. Anonymous sources. Documented evidence. A detailed account of the coordinated nature of the attacks on Taegun's holdings, framed not as the deserved collapse of a criminal enterprise, but as a calculated hostile takeover using legal mechanisms as weapons. The moral geography of the room shifted. People who had turned their backs half turned back, uncertain now. Park Hyun-soo's champagne seemed to have gone flat. He was on his phone, his pleasant expression replaced by something tighter. 2 of the creditors at the event began speaking quietly to their lawyers. Nobody understood what was happening. Nobody could trace the source. The intervention was seamless, invisible, executed with a precision that suggested not improvisation but architecture, something built over time, designed for exactly this moment. Taegun felt it before he understood it, a change in atmospheric pressure. He scanned the room slowly, methodically, the way a man scans a battlefield, not for threats but for origin points, and then, almost against his own volition, his gaze found her, Adeobi, standing near the window, still, composed, holding her glass of water. To every other person in the room, she looked exactly as she always had, decorative, peripheral, irrelevant, but Taegun had spent years reading rooms for survival, and something in the angle of her posture, something in the absolute quality of her stillness, which was not passive stillness, but the stillness of a chess player who has already made the decisive move and is simply watching the board respond, drove a cold spike of recognition straight through his chest. He stared at her. She did not look back. But the corner of her mouth moved, just barely, and Seo Taegun, the man who had never, in his adult life, been truly surprised by another human being, felt the floor shift beneath him. 3 months earlier, the world had looked entirely different. Taegun's syndicate operated through a network of legitimate businesses that would have impressed any international commerce professor. Import logistics, private equity, luxury hospitality, strategic commodities. The criminal infrastructure beneath it was a different architecture entirely, but no less impressive. Built over 15 years. Reinforced through strategic violence, strategic generosity, and an almost supernatural ability to identify both threats and opportunities before they fully materialized, people feared him, not the performative fear that surrounded men who simply had money or muscle. The deeper fear, the kind that came from knowing that Seo Taegun could see you more clearly than you could see yourself, and that he would use everything he saw with perfect, unhurried precision. His father had built the foundation. Taegun had built the cathedral. And then, in the span of 6 weeks, someone had burned it down. The method was elegant in its brutality. IT began with a regulatory audit, seemingly routine, actually anything but. Then a leak. Confidential financial communications, selectively edited for maximum damage, appeared in the hands of 3 journalists simultaneously. Then a former associate, arrested on separate charges, began cooperating with prosecutors and offering a narrative about Taegun's operations that was 50% accurate and 100% damaging. Accounts froze. Partners panicked. The legitimate businesses, without liquidity, began hemorrhaging clients, and the underground infrastructure, which depended on reputation as much as force, found that reputation is a structure with no secondary supports. When it falls completely. Within 6 weeks, men who had prostrated themselves before Seo Taegun were calculating whether their future interests were better served by his survival or his extinction. Most chose extinction. The marriage to Adeobi had come 4 years prior. IT had been Taegun's lawyer, a precise, humorless man named Choi Woo-jin, who had first surfaced the Nwafir family connection, an African network with significant positioning across West Africa and several European financial corridors. The Nwafir patriarch had died, leaving behind a daughter who had been educated in London and Geneva, who spoke 4 languages, who had no known enemies and no obvious ambitions. Strategically useful, Choi had said, politically neutral. She won't complicate things. Taegun had met Adeobi twice before the wedding. He had found her, in those 2 meetings, to be exactly what Choi described: quiet, intelligent, composed. She asked no unnecessary questions. She expressed no visible desires. She was, in the vocabulary Taegun used for human assessment, a non-variable. He had not been unkind to her. He simply had not fully registered her. There was always something more urgent. Always a fire to manage, a loyalty to test, a threat to neutralize. She existed in his peripheral vision as a stable element, present, appropriate, undemanding. He told himself this was respect. He did not examine the lie closely enough to see what it actually was. The first anomaly appeared 11 days into the collapse. A hostile acquisition of his primary Singapore logistics company should have been completed by a rival consortium. The filing was in order. The financing was secured. 3 separate legal teams had reviewed and approved the mechanism. IT failed, not because of anything Taegun's remaining team had done. They hadn't even known to attempt a countermeasure. IT failed because a single obscure maritime regulation, one that had existed in Singapore's commercial law for 30 years without ever being relevant, had been identified and applied in a way that created an irresolvable conflict with the acquisition structure. Taegun's lawyer, reviewing the collapse, had said, "Someone found this on purpose. This isn't a coincidence." This was researched. The second anomaly came 8 days later. Critical evidence that prosecutors had been planning to use in their case against 2 of his holding companies, evidence that his own legal team had been dreading, simply disappeared. Not destroyed. Not stolen. Administratively mishandled in a way that made it inadmissible. A chain of custody error so precise it was almost beautiful. Then an anonymous investor, routed through a series of Maltese and Mauritian entities, quietly rescued his smallest but most structurally important private equity fund, preventing a cascading collapse that would have destroyed 3 times the value. Taegun launched an internal investigation. He assigned 3 separate teams, instructed them to work independently, and told them to identify the origin of these interventions. All 3 teams hit walls. The Singapore legal maneuver traced to a consultancy firm that didn't substantively exist. The evidence mishandling traced to a mid-level bureaucratic error that had no obvious human author. The investment fund rescue dissolved into a series of entities that each legally existed but collectively pointed nowhere. Someone with extraordinary capability and extraordinary patience was operating on his behalf, and they did not want to be found. Meanwhile, Adeobi remained exactly what she had always appeared to be. She woke early. She was unfailingly composed. She attended the social obligations required of her. She spoke when spoken to, retreated when the conversation ceased to require her, and moved through the household with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long ago mastered the art of taking up precisely the right amount of space, and not a centimeter more. But Taegun was paying attention now. He noticed the phone that she silenced rather than simply put away when he entered rooms. He noticed that twice in 1 week, his head of household security mentioned that Mrs. Seo had received visitors. Quiet, professionally dressed individuals, during hours when Taegun was occupied elsewhere. He noticed that on a Tuesday morning when a particularly damaging financial story about him broke across 3 major platforms, Adeobi had been awake since 4 a.m. He had seen the light under her private sitting room doored. He noticed that she possessed, without any evident source, specific knowledge about the structure of an ongoing threat against him. Knowledge, she revealed accidentally in a single sentence during what appeared to be casual conversation, then immediately redirected the topic with a grace that he had previously interpreted as disinterest, but now recognized as something far more controlled. He stood outside his own investigation and confronted a realization that felt profoundly disorienting. He did not know his wife. He had shared a home with her for 4 years, attended events beside her, spoken to her daily, and he did not know who she actually was. The thought did not make him angry. It made him afraid. And Seo Taegun had not been afraid of a person in over a decade. The circumstances of empire collapse are, paradoxically, intimate. When the external world strips away your buffers, the staff, the meetings, the constant, orchestrated busyness that keeps powerful men from having to sit in the same room with their own lives, what remains is proximity. He and Adeobi drove together to Busan for a meeting that required both their presences. 4 hours in a car. The driver behind soundproof glass. No phones, by mutual unspoken agreement. For the first 90 minutes, she read. He watched the highway. The silence between them was not comfortable, exactly. But it was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who had coexisted long enough to stop performing within it, which meant that something more honest was available, if either of them chose to reach for it. After an hour, he said, without looking at her, "You've been awake most nights this week." She turned a page. "Sleep is difficult sometimes." "Since when?" Not a question, exactly. She looked up, her eyes, dark, very steady, met his for a moment that lasted slightly longer than casual conversation required. "A while," she said. Then she returned to her book, but he had seen it, just for that suspended second before she rearranged her expression. Something underneath the composure. Not weakness. Something more complex than weakness. The exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something enormous for a very long time, alone, and has become so practiced at the carrying that they no longer remember what it felt like not to. He had seen that expression before. He had seen it in mirrors. In the years when his father's empire was falling apart and Taegun was 17 years old and quietly holding the infrastructure together before anyone knew he was capable of it, he recognized it precisely because it was his own. The drive continued. Later that week, during a meeting in Seoul, he watched her navigate a room full of dangerous men. She did it the way she always did, with absolute economy. A word here, a silence there. She gave nothing away, but she was not cold. She managed the temperature of the room without anyone noticing she was doing it. He thought, "I've been in this room with her 100 times. And I never watched this before. Why didn't I watch this before?" He began to understand, slowly, the specific nature of what he had done. Not with guilt. Guilt was an emotion for people who believed they had surprised themselves. What Taegun felt was more precise. A forensic accounting of choices. The recognition that he had arranged the terms of this marriage to guarantee that he would never have to truly see her, and that she had responded to those terms in the only way available to a person of intelligence and dignity. She had become invisible, by his design, and then she had used that invisibility in ways he had never anticipated. What he could not yet access was what any of it meant to her. Whether she had protected him from strategy, or from something he hadn't let himself name yet. He was afraid to ask. For a man who feared nothing, this was its own form of devastation. His name was Emeka Ose-Mensah, 44 years old. Born in Accra. Educated in Paris. A legitimate billionaire with holdings across West Africa, the UK, and Southeast Asia, and the kind of effortless authority that comes not from violence, but from the genuine confidence of a man who has never needed to prove himself in rooms that didn't want him there. He had business reasons to be in Seoul. He made those reasons very clear. He also made something else very clear, with the unhurried confidence of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. He noticed Adeobi, not in the cursory, socially obligatory way that most of Taegun's associates had noticed her over 4 years. In the way that suggests a person has registered you as the most interesting thing in a room full of ostensibly important things. A TA business dinner hosted by a mutual financial contact. Emeka Osemensa spent 45 minutes in conversation with Adeobi. Not the performance of conversation, not the polite, extractive exchange of information that passed for connection in these environments, but actual conversation. He asked her questions and listened to the answers. He responded to her specific words, not to a generalized impression of her. Taegun sat at the other end of the table. He was speaking with a banking contact. His face was composed. His responses were appropriate. He was watching every second of the conversation 45 minutes away. This was new. He had never in his life experienced jealousy as a physical phenomenon. He had known it academically, recognized it in others as a vulnerability to be filed and potentially used. But this sensation in his chest, this careful, controlled, utterly cold fury at the sight of another man looking at his wife with genuine attention, this was something he had no prior architecture for. He did not make a scene. He did not interrupt. He was Seo Taegun. He did not express his feelings for rooms. But when he and Adeobi left together that night, the silence in the car was a different quality entirely. She noticed it immediately. She was, of course, an expert at reading atmospheres. After 11 minutes of silence, she said, very quietly, "He's simply a decent man, Taegun." He said nothing. That conversation was about business. Specifically, about supply chain positioning in coastal West Africa. "I didn't ask," he said.
"No," she said.
"You didn't." Another silence. Then she turned to look at him. Not the quick, self-protective glance she usually used, but a long, straight look. "Would you have noticed," she said slowly, "if he hadn't?" He had no answer. The question sat between them for the rest of the drive. He could not sleep that night. He lay in the dark and thought about the specific texture of what Emeka Osemensa had given Adeobi in 45 minutes, the quality of attention, the act of being genuinely seen and understood, with the clarity of someone who prefers not to lie to themselves, that in 4 years of marriage he had not given her this, not once, not meaningfully, and she had never asked for it, had never complained, had never. He stopped the thought, because the next thought was worse. She had protected him. Anyway, whatever she felt or didn't feel, whatever she had received or not received from this marriage, she had spent years quietly ensuring his survival. He didn't understand it yet, but the need to understand it had become the most urgent thing in his life, more urgent than the empire, more urgent than the enemies, more urgent than anything. It was Choi Woo-jin who found the thread. Working through a corporate registry in Mauritius, while pursuing the anonymous investor entity that had rescued the private equity fund, he encountered a company name that appeared once, briefly, before dissolving back into the layered structure around it, Nwafra Meridian Holdings. He did not understand its significance immediately. He ran it anyway. The entity traced back 18 months. Then further, to a registration in Luxembourg 4 years old. Then further, to a trust structure established in the Cayman Islands over a decade prior. Then to a name, Emmanuel Ikechukwu Nwafra, Adeobi's father, dead for 9 years. Choi sat with what he was looking at for a long moment, then sent Taegun a message with no text. Only a file attachment. Taegun read it over the course of 90 minutes, during which he did not move from his chair, did not accept phone calls, and did not make any visible expression whatsoever. The picture that assembled itself from the documents was this. Emmanuel Nwafra had not been simply an influential African patriarch with useful connections. He had built, over 30 years, a private international financial network of extraordinary sophistication. Quiet infrastructure. Unglamorous, but strategically positioned across West African trade corridors, European financial mechanisms, and Southeast Asian logistics operations. Not criminal, or rather, operating in the vast gray territories between criminality and legitimacy that global commerce has always depended on. When he died, he had left it to his daughter, not because she was his only heir, because she was the only person he trusted with it. And she had inherited it at 26 years old and spent 3 years quietly consolidating it before her marriage to Seo Tae-gun was ever proposed, which meant she had never been what anyone thought she was, not in the meeting where Choi had described her as politically neutral, not in the 2 conversations Tae-gun had used to assess her before agreeing to the marriage, not in any single moment of the 4 years they had shared a home. She had come into this marriage with more structural power than the man she was marrying. She had simply chosen, for reasons Tae-gun was only beginning to grasp, not to deploy it until it became necessary. The Singapore legal maneuver. Her network, the evidence mishandling. Her connections, the investment rescue. Her capital, every intervention. Every protection. Every invisible hand that had reached out of the darkness to prevent his complete destruction. Her. All of it. Tae-gun sat in his office until 4 in the morning. He thought about the years. He thought about every room he had walked into with her standing beside him, dismissed, unnoticed, overlooked, while she carried a financial architecture that could have purchased and sold most of the people in those rooms. He thought about the late-night lights under her sitting room door. He thought about the question she had asked in the car. Would you have noticed if he hadn't? He thought about what it must have felt like to love someone who never truly looked at you, to protect someone who never knew you were protecting them, to carry a secret that would have changed everything if revealed, and to choose, day after day, to remain invisible. Because that was what the documents didn't explain, the why. She hadn't needed to protect him. Her network was independent of his. His collapse posed no threat to her. She could have watched him fall with minimal personal consequence and considerable practical freedom. She had chosen to protect him anyway, without his knowledge, without his gratitude, without anything in return. And that single fact, that simple, devastating, inexplicable fact, broke something open in the center of Seo Tae-gun's chest that had not been open in a very long time. The documents reached the wrong hands on a Wednesday. He never discovered exactly how. A leak from within his own investigation team, most likely placed there by the same enemy who had orchestrated the original collapse. But the documents were edited before they arrived anywhere public, selectively,
surgically,
with the same elegant precision that had characterized every move in this campaign. What leaked was not the truth of what Adeobi had done, not the protection, not the rescue operations, not the invisible architecture of loyalty operating in the shadows of his crisis. What leaked was a version in which Adeobi's concealed network appeared not as a protective mechanism, but as a parallel operation, in which her secret inheritance appeared not as something she had protected him with, but as something she had withheld from him, in which the question being quietly seeded across the networks of his remaining allies was, what else has she concealed? What has she been building in the shadows that you don't know about? Is she protecting him or positioning herself for when he falls? It was designed for him. It was designed to reach him in exactly the configuration most likely to trigger the specific wound it needed to trigger, the fundamental distrust, the deep and barely acknowledged fear of being a fool, of being the one person in the room who did not understand what was actually happening. And it worked. Not completely. Not immediately. But when Tae-gun confronted her, and the confrontation, when it came, was cold rather than explosive, which was worse. The versions of events were too similar in structure and too different in meaning, and the breach that opened between them was too old and too deep to be bridged by a single conversation. You built something, he said, and you hid it. For 4 years. Yes, she said. In this marriage. Yes. And you didn't tell me. She looked at him for a long moment, then, tell me something, Tae-gun. If I had walked into this marriage and placed my network on the table in front of you, everything my father built, everything I inherited, what would you have done with it? He didn't answer. You would have used it, she said, not with bitterness, simply with accuracy. And I would have become an asset in your portfolio, something to be managed, not someone to be known. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm telling you what I knew, what I had seen in 2 meetings and everything I understood about how you operated. And so you concealed it. I protected it. There is a difference. From your husband. The words sat between them. Husband, after a moment she said. You didn't want a wife. You wanted a variable that would remain stable. I tried to be exactly what you needed for 4 years, and I tried to protect you in the only way available to me. And I understand that this feels like a betrayal. I understand why." She stood. She was not crying. Her composure was absolute and completely devastating because it was not a performance. It was the composure of a person who has already done all of their grief somewhere private, over a long period of time, and has nothing left to perform. "I think," she said, "I have been invisible in this marriage for long enough." She walked out. Taegun did not follow. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the architectural evidence of everything she had done for him, and let her go, because he was still looking at it through the wrong lens, because the enemy's version was sitting inside him alongside the truth, contaminating it, because some wounds, when they reopen, override everything else. The door closed. The room was very quiet. And within 48 hours, every intervention that had been protecting him stopped. The legal mechanisms fell dormant. The invisible investors withdrew. The protective intelligence dried up, and Taegun's remaining structure began to destabilize with a sudden speed that made clear, in the most brutal possible way, exactly how much of his survival had depended on something he had not understood until it was gone. The name was Baek Sungreal, 61 years old, former associate of Taegun's father from the founding years of the syndicate. A man who had been passed over, decisively, humiliatingly, when the elder CEO had chosen his son as successor rather than the man who believed himself entitled to it. Baek had spent 15 years assembling patience like capital. He had never made a direct move. He was too intelligent for that. Instead, he had built, slowly, quietly, through proxies and mechanisms and the strategic placement of his people inside Taegun's most trusted structures, the exact architecture he would need when the moment finally came. The collapse of the empire had been Baek's masterwork, not just the financial destruction, the social architecture of it, the ally abandonment, the timed leaks, the legal mechanisms, the narrative cultivation that reframed Taegun's fall as inevitable, deserved a long overdue correction. He had understood one thing with crystalline clarity. CO Taegun alone was dangerous, but CO Taegun and Adaebin Wafer understood, truly understood, as a combined operational force, was something that could not be beaten directly. He hadn't attacked directly. He had attacked the space between them. He knew about Adaebi's network. His people had discovered it 18 months earlier, and rather than treating it as a threat to be neutralized, Baek had recognized it as a weapon that could be turned, not against Taegun, between them, the forged narrative, the selectively edited documents, the carefully worded implication, never stated, never provable, always present, that the concealment was sinister rather than protective. He had separated them, and the moment they separated, everything else had simply collapsed as designed. Taegun discovered this through a source he had cultivated for years inside a competitor's intelligence operation, a source who surfaced, after 3 weeks of Taegun working in the cold, with enough documentation to reconstruct the conspiracy. He sat with it for 6 hours. He read everything. He went back and reread the documents about Adaebi's network, but this time understanding the chronology, when each intervention had occurred, what it had cost, what risk it had required, what she had been managing simultaneously. She had been running a protection operation for his benefit while managing her own inherited network and performing the role of invisible wife in his household, without assistance, without acknowledgement, without any indication that she expected recognition or reciprocation for years. He thought about the question she had asked him in the car. Would you have noticed if he hadn't? The honest answer was no. He would not have. He would have continued existing beside her with the fundamental arrogance of a man who believes the absence of conflict means the absence of depth, who mistakes silence for simplicity, who looks at a composed woman and sees a stable variable rather than a person engaged in the most complex form of emotional labor imaginable. He had been, in the most precise and undeniable sense, a fool, not strategically, not professionally, personally, the feared Mafia boss, the man who could read any room, any person, any structure, had failed to read the one person who slept in the same home and was managing the largest operation in his life from the silence he had assigned her. He sat with this for a long time. He did not perform the feeling. He simply let it exist, which was something Seo Tae-gun had rarely done with things that hurt. Then he stood, and he began to work. It took 11 days. He worked with 3 things: what remained of his own resources, the intelligence about Beck's network that his source had provided, and a set of contacts he had never fully activated because he had never needed to reach this deep. He did not contact Adeobi, not because he was still angry, not because he had not processed what he knew, because what he wanted to give her was not words. Words had been insufficient in this marriage from the beginning. He had used the right words when required and withheld them when they might have meant something, and she had done the same in reverse, protecting him with action while receiving nothing in return. He did not want to offer her more words. He wanted to offer her something that cost him what her protection had cost her. Beck's network, dismantled from the inside, took 8 days. His own people knew their assignments. Tae-gun directed the operation with a controlled precision that had built his empire in the first place, and something about operating without the cushion of wealth, stripped back to pure strategy and nerve, clarified his instincts in a way that decades of security had softened. On day 8, Baek Sungreul's primary structure collapsed under the combined weight of regulatory interventions across 3 jurisdictions, the surfacing of evidence about his role in the original conspiracy, and the coordinated withdrawal of the remaining allies who had supported him under the belief that he was the rising power in this conflict. He was not. He had never understood, in 30 years of patient planning, that the target he was destroying had been protecting something Beck had completely failed to account for. On day 9, Tae-gun called the one number he had not dialed in 3 weeks. She answered on the 3rd ring. She said nothing. He said, "I know what I read. I know what I did with it. I know that neither of those things is sufficient as an apology." Silence. "There's something I need to do," he said. "I need you present for it. After that, whatever you decide, I'll respect it." A very long pause then. Where? The gathering had been called under the pretense of a major business announcement. 400 people attended. Business leaders. Financial power. Political adjacency. Criminal infrastructure wearing the suits of legitimate enterprise. Several journalists. A number of the same people who had been present at the auction hall when Park Hyun-soo had made his toast. Tae-gun stood at the front of the room. He did not have notes. He began by laying out, with precision, the full account of Baek Sungreul's conspiracy. The mechanisms. The timeline. The specific actions taken against his empire. He delivered this with the even, documented authority of someone who has evidence and knows it, and within 6 minutes the room had understood that what it believed about the fall of Tae-gun's empire was structurally false. He then announced the reconstruction of his holdings, partially through his own remaining resources, partially through the reallocation of assets recovered from Beck's network. The room shifted. Relief in some faces. Calculation in others. Discomfort in those who had been most visibly gleeful during the fall. Then he paused. The pause lasted long enough that people began to look at each other, and then he said, "There is something else. Something I should have said publicly a long time ago, but I will say it now because it has taken me too long to understand it, and longer still to deserve saying it." He looked across the room, to where Adeobi stood, near the far edge, exactly as she always stood, composed, contained, present without announcing herself. He did not gesture for her to approach. He looked at her directly, across 400 people, and spoke to her as though the room contained only 2. "While I was fighting to survive, while the men in this room were calculating whether my extinction was more useful to them than my survival, my wife was operating a protection network on my behalf that none of you knew existed, and that I did not deserve. She used resources that were hers alone, built by her father and maintained by her own intelligence and discipline, to keep my empire alive when I could not. She did this without asking me, without telling me, without receiving credit or gratitude or any acknowledgement that a person who does what she did for someone they love deserves." The room was absolutely silent. "She did it," he continued, "because she is the most capable, most disciplined, most quietly powerful person I have ever encountered. And because, though I gave her no sufficient reason to, she loved me. And I was too arrogant for too long to see it." He was still looking at her. Her face, across the room, was still, but something had shifted in it. Something careful was opening. I am not standing here to tell you that my empire is restored. I am standing here to tell you what actually built it, and what actually saved it, and who was carrying it when I believed I was carrying it alone. He crossed the room, not quickly, with the deliberate pace of someone who has finally decided to stop performing and simply move toward the thing that matters. He stopped in front of her. He did not speak for a moment. She looked up at him, eye and her eyes, those dark, steady, infinitely patient eyes. He saw the architecture of everything she had managed to feel for him across 4 years of deliberate invisibility. And the question that was still present would probably always be present now, about whether this was enough, whether anything could be enough, whether love was sufficient to rebuild what neglect had quietly damaged. He did not try to answer that question with words, but he took her hand, publicly, deliberately. His hand, scarred, tattooed, the hand that had built a criminal empire and dismantled a conspiracy, wrapped around hers and held it with a firmness that said, in the only language he had ever fully trusted, I see you. I see what you are. I will not look away from you again. The room watched, some in confusion, some in something more complicated. Park Hyun-soo, standing near the middle of the crowd, looked like a man recalibrating everything he believed about the room's power structure, which was, in fact, exactly what he was doing. They stood together before the world. He was, for the first time in his public life, completely unguarded. No performance of invulnerability. No architecture of fear or authority to hide behind. Just a man, standing beside a woman he had failed to see, choosing, now, publicly, irrevocably, to stop. The enemies had been defeated. The conspiracy was dismantled. The empire was in the process of being rebuilt, differently now, with her network no longer concealed but acknowledged, no longer parallel but interwoven. The marriage was not restored in the way that marriages are restored in stories where people simply forgive and the music swells. It was rebuilt in the harder way, the way that requires people to begin again with more honesty than they used the first time, knowing each other more accurately, choosing each other more deliberately. There would be conversations that had not yet happened. There would be silences that needed to become different kinds of silence. There would be the ongoing, imperfect, utterly unglamorous work of being truly known by another person rather than simply seen. But it would begin. Because standing in that room, with her hand in his, and the world rearranging its understanding of who held power and why, Adeobi Nwafor finally allowed herself the thing she had denied herself for 4 years. She let herself be seen, not as a variable, not as a background detail, not as the quiet wife, as herself, the woman who had inherited an empire and used it to protect a man who didn't know she had it, the woman who had carried a secret large enough to reshape everything and released it, finally, not in triumph, but in the exhausted grace of someone who has been strong for a very long time and has finally found a reason to rest. She looked back at him, and in the complicated, unresolved, entirely human space between what they had been and what they were choosing to become, she held his hand. The ruthless Mafia boss had chosen love over power, and this time, with the weight of everything they now knew about each other, with the full accounting of what had been given and what had been withheld and what had survived regardless, he did not let go.